and this city will now become the focus of our story for the next 2 chapters. In verse 19, we're told that Babylon is now receiving the cup of wine of God's wrath. Bowls and cups are commonly used in Scripture as symbols. They store up God's wrath for a later time when it be poured out upon the deserving objects of God's anger. This is now the fate of Babylon, but the concept of Babylon is complex, which is why it requires 2 chapters to deal with her destruction. The destruction of Babylon is one of 2 major themes of the Bible. The other major theme, redemption through Jesus Christ. These 2 themes play against one another throughout all of Scripture. Babylon serves as the antagonist to Christ's protagonist in that story. But Jesus identifies us slowly in stages over the course of Scripture, so Babylon is slowly unveiled. The word Babylon in Scripture carries multiple meanings. In fact, Babylon stands for 5 related concepts in the Bible. The first, Babylon is the home of sin because it's the location of the Garden of Eden in present-day Iraq. So let's look at Genesis 2:10 through 14. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. It also along the east side of Asher. And the fourth river is Euphrates. The Garden of Eden was the location of Satan's original attack against God. After Satan's fall in heaven, he was removed from his position in the heavenly tabernacle. Later, Satan's jealousy over the creation of man and woman led Satan to attack Adam and bring mankind into sin. At that point, Satan gained domination over the earth, having taken it from Adam when Adam obeyed him instead of God. So Babylon is ground zero for the start of sin on earth and the beginning of his battle with God over control of the earth. Furthermore, Babylon has been Satan's home territory, its stronghold. Today, this region continues to be heavily guarded by Satan and his dark forces. Demonic activity seems to be especially strong in these areas today as well. So when you hear the word Babylon, you should think of the home of Satan and sin. Secondly, Babylon was the source of idolatry on earth. Genesis 11 records how men gathered in Babel under the leadership of a man called Nimrod. Nimrod was the Antichrist of his day, and his story even serves as a picture of the Antichrist. Nimrod was an all-powerful world leader of everyone in that day. He calls for a new kind of worship, one that leads mankind into a project building a tower that will reach to heaven. While the goal may seem like folly, it was actually deadly serious because the Babylon Tower was the start of idolatry among mankind. The tower was the first false religion, and like all religion, it attempted to replace obedience to God with a man-made way to reach heaven. In the first case, their attempt to reach heaven was literal, using tower of mud and bricks. But beyond their foolish act were hearts that believed for the first time that it was possible to make your own way to God. The building of the Tower of Babel was no coincidence. Who do you think was behind the idea? Who do you think was behind the idea of building that tower? Satan. Satan used Nimrod to establish the thinking that men could define their own way to reach heaven. The Lord responded by scattering people, confusing language to each. Such a worldwide rebellion would be more difficult in the future. Since that time, languages have kept men separated and fighting one another rather than organizing against God. Until recent times, the Western culture and the internet have increasingly reunited world under a common language. So as the world overcomes the barrier of language, a new worldwide rebellion against God becomes possible yet again. So when you hear the word Babylon, we need to think the source of idolatry. The third Babylon is the first Gentile kingdom to conquer the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. Prior to Nebuchadnezzar, no Gentile nation had ever succeeded in overpowering God's people. God permitted Babylon to conquer Israel as part of his plan to discipline his people for their sins. And in that way, Babylon becomes the first of the nations to control Israel during the age of the Gentiles. And as we studied in Daniel, the man at the head of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is also a picture of the Antichrist. God permitted Babylon to conquer Israel, but he also promised to eventually punish Babylon for their cruelty against Israel. So let's look at Jeremiah 51:24. Before their eyes I will repay Babylon and all who live in Babylonia for all the wrong they have done in Zion, declares the Lord. And the times of the Gentiles will end in a similar manner. A single Gentile ruler controlling the entire world and persecuting Israel, controlling both Jerusalem and Babylon. This will be the Antichrist kingdom, and like the first Babylon, this final Babylon will be used by God to discipline his people. Yet, as God promised, the discipline will not be to Israel's destruction. So when we hear the word Babylon, we need to think God's instrument to discipline Israel. Fourth, Babylon becomes the seat of power for the Antichrist during the time of tribulation. Some interpreters argue over whether the Babylon reference in Revelation refers to the historical city or the symbol of Satan. But Scripture makes clear that Babylon in Revelation is both a literal place and a biblical symbol. We're already seeing in Revelation 16 that the Antichrist resides in the geographical Babylon near the Euphrates River. When the Euphrates River dries up, it becomes the opportunity for the Antichrist to bring the world's armies to Israel. Also, the seven-bowl judgment declared that the great city, which is also Babylon, would be destroyed like the other Gentile cities. Again, a destruction of the city of Babylon is singled out precisely because the city has become a center of power again. The Antichrist moves the world's seat of power to Babylon during tribulation at the point when he is indwelled by Satan. And that makes sense, since we know Satan's home has always been in Mesopotamia. So naturally, his headquarters are world government in that city. So when we hear the word Babylon, we need to think the seat of power in the last days. Finally, because Babylon is the home of the father of the lies and the seat of power for the Antichrist during tribulation, the city stands for false religion in general. Babylon does not represent one specific false religion, but all false religions systems Satan has invented. Because in reality, there are only two religious systems on earth. One is the way of God made available by his promise found in his word and through our faith in the work of Christ. Everything else is Babylon. The enemy's counterfeit religion, which began in the garden, took shape at Babel and eventually gave birth to accountable numbers of children. Today's smorgasbord of religious choice is a testimony of the enemy's proliferation of lies. Creating many false religions plays to Satan's advantage in two ways. First, it camouflages the truth, leading to confusion and making it harder for someone to find the truth. And secondly, it perpetuates the myth that there are many roads to heaven so that all religions seem equally valid. So when we hear the word Babylon, we need to think all false religion. Putting all this together, we find that Babylon is both a literal, physical place of importance in the end times and a seat of spiritual power in Scripture. It is a physical location where sin began and a spiritual home for Satan and rebellion. It was starting point for idolatry and the source of all hatred and oppression against God's people in the age of Gentiles. Babylon represents all of Satan's false religions and untold damage they have done over the millennia. So Babylon becomes representing of everything Satan is and all that he does to undermine the truth and oppose God. Just as other places like Sodom or Las Vegas convey certain meaning, so is the term Babylon loaded with meaning. And as Babylon is a poster child for Satan and evil, so Jerusalem symbolizes the opposite. It's the city of God and a place of redemption. Jerusalem is God's dwelling place, the capital of his people, and the place of Christ's sacrifice. It will be the seat of Christ's government and the center of the world and the kingdom. So as Babylon is for Satan, so Jerusalem is for Jesus. Therefore, Babylon and Jerusalem are always set opposed to one another in all Scripture, though that relationship is often hard to see. Generally, it's expressed simply in terms of cardinal direction rather than by specific titles. So Babylon is east of Jerusalem, and therefore the direction east represents evil. Similarly, Jerusalem is in the west, and so moving west is a picture of moving away from evil and toward the Lord. For example, after Adam was created, the Lord put him in a garden in the east, representing Adam moving toward sin. Later, Cain is sent to the east after he murders Abel. Then Abraham was sent from Ur in the east to the promised land in the west, moving the paganism that they had created there to faith. Even Jesus moved from the west of the Jordan to the east to meet Satan in his temptations in the wilderness. And this pattern happens time and time again, with characters moving east or west suggesting a spiritual change as well. And now, in this climatic end to the age of the Gentiles, the figurative has become the literal. Where before Babylon and Jerusalem pictured the dichotomy of evil versus good, now they have become the literal battleground. The only two cities left standing at the end of the age are Babylon and Jerusalem. The Lord has narrowed the focus of the world onto two locations, and with the bold judgments, he brings Satan from the east to the west to attack Jerusalem for a final battle. We know that the bold judgments of tribulation are the final wrath of God upon earth. Therefore, these tribulation judgments must bring an end to Babylon in all her forms. When all is said and done, Satan's influence must be ended. The Antichrist and his base of power, the city of Babylon, must be destroyed. But more than that, all false religion must come to an end, as well as all rebellion and idolatry. So in the seventh bowl judgment, Babylon, the great city, will fall. The physical city coming to an end, including its political, economic, and military power. Once and for all, the city that stands opposing to God and his people will be gone. But spiritual Babylon will also be destroyed. All false religions will end, all idolatry, including the idol of wealth, anything that could compete with the worship of Christ. All things Babylon will be conquered in preparation for Christ's return. We see Babylon destroyed in two parts. Chapter 17, we see God judging spiritual Babylon. The Lord brings an end to false religion and its control over the unbelieving world. Interestingly, the Lord uses the father of false religion, Satan himself, to complete that destruction. Secondly, with spiritual Babylon defeated, chapter 18 describes the judgment of the physical city of Babylon. The Antichrist makes the city a seat of military and financial power in the last days of tribulation. So the Lord brings the city to ruin, robbing it of its wealth, power, and prestige. We now see judgment against spiritual Babylon. In chapter 17, we get a puzzle to solve, but the answer to the puzzle all appear in the chapter more or less. No. Read Revelation 17. So that's what we're going to look at right now. We're going to look at 17, 1 through 8. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus.